And given the tradition, the venerable tradition of this series as having to do and oriented around questions of democracy, I want to go to where John Palmer began us, suggesting that no faith presents more challenges to democracy than Islam today. We've just seen a clip that suggests it could be otherwise, and yet that seems a pretty accurate description of reality. Talk a bit about the situation of democracy in Islamic countries, specific as you want to be, or general, but I think that's what a lot of us have come here to hear you reflect on first.
Well, first of all, Rogan, I have to congratulate you. I'm sure you've been called a sellout on many occasions, but this is for the right reasons.
Not me.
So this is, thank you all for being here, and thank you to Syracuse University for having the guts to invite Rogan, and secondarily me. So really, it's a privilege and a pleasure to be here. You know, I would love to believe the very fashionable idea that the prospects of stable democracy would increase dramatically if the Middle East got the hell, if America got the hell out of the Middle East. But I'm a journalist, and so I have to pay attention to reality on the ground, and sometimes in the ground. And the reality is that in the last 80 to 100 years alone, as you heard me allude in one of the interviews I did for the documentary, more Muslims have been imprisoned, maimed, raped, tortured, and murdered at the hands of fellow Muslims than at the hands of any foreign imperial power. Now, when I point that out, please understand, I am not denying Western imperialism. I was born in Uganda, small country in East Africa, which was colonized by the British. I've seen imperialism from the West up close and personal. What I'm pointing out instead is that imperialism comes in many shades and many skin colors, and that includes Islamist colonization of other Muslims. And in fact, it behooves us to acknowledge that wars for domination have been raging in the world of Islam ever since the death of the Prophet Muhammad. We Muslims have to own up to this sad reality. And until we do, I don't think that there will be authentic hope for stability, let alone for democracy. But the good news, I think, Rogan, is that the Quran gives us plenty of room to experiment with different forms of governance, including separation of mosque and state, otherwise known as secularism in this part of the world, including respect for minority rights, aspiration to women's equality, rule of law, transparency, independent judiciary, all of which are central to any functioning democracy. So Islam as a faith offers the raw materials to realize this vision. Whether this vision will be realized is not going to be a matter of chance. It'll be a matter of choice. And it'll be we Muslims, first and foremost, who have to make that choice. We have to show that amongst ourselves, never mind with the rest of the world, we have democratic aspirations. And until we do, or I should say when we do, only then, I think, will we have the legitimacy to hold the West to account for any barriers it's throwing in the way of our demonstrable democratic aspirations.
I'll press you a bit further on exactly this theme. As a social scientist, I'm trained to pursue empirical analyses, and I look around the world now, or in my lifetime, let's say, in vain for majority Muslim countries that practice something resembling democratic-style politics. Is that, as some people seem to conclude now, I think ruefully, a suggestion that these are just incompatible? You've suggested not, but I'm going to push you a bit farther.
Right.
What has gone wrong since the days of Averroes or centuries and centuries ago, so that what is now around the world, the form of government that's really the only one considered morally legitimate, so much so that that North Korea, maybe the least democratic state the world sees now, calls itself the People's Democratic Republic of North Korea.
Right.
Why can't these majority Muslim states seem to get it right?
By
our lights.
Yeah. I would say, obviously, there are many variables. Many would argue that, again, Western colonization and intrusion is key among them. I would say that's one of the variables, but I wouldn't say that that's the bigger factor. I've argued in my book, and I maintain to this day, because, again, of all that I've seen on the ground, that the biggest factor of all is what I would call Arab cultural imperialism. And I'm referring specifically, Rogan, to the tribalism that persists today within so much of Arab culture. I'm going to give you a very concrete example of what I mean by that. I mentioned earlier that the aspiration to women's equality is a cornerstone of democracy. And the Quran certainly gives us the room to aspire to women's equality. It points out very expressly that women and men are utterly equal in the eyes of God. And that what defines the purity of a believer is not one's gender, but one's actions. Now, you know, there's not too much wiggle room in that kind of a statement. You don't have to interpret it out of what it actually means. What then has gone wrong in terms of acknowledging the talent and then using the talent of more than 50% of the population in many of these countries? And I would say it is Arab tribal culture with a specific tradition called honor. Honor. Now, the U.S. South has had honor. Japan has had honor. Within Arab tribal tradition, honor is the custom that requires women to give up their individuality in order to maintain the reputation of the men in their lives. This, in effect, turns women into communal property, property of the community, so that their lives don't in fact belong to them. Their lives belong to a wider group of people, their families, their tribes, sometimes even their nations, which means when a Muslim woman to whom honor is applied is accused of dishonoring, of shaming, or of breaking moral codes, the punishment against her can be so much bigger than even the supposed crime that she has been accused of merits. Why? Because remember, again, under the code of honor, her life doesn't belong to her. It belongs to a wider group, and therefore any penalty that she incurs for dishonoring herself and therefore the group must be large enough to compensate for that wider group. This tradition of honor can actually be mangled to the point of unconscionable human rights abuses. Many of us, of course, have heard about honor killings and honor crimes, but let me even shine a light on something that needs to be understood. Before Hamas became government in the occupied territories, it issued a statement saying that women will finally be eligible to become suicide bombers. Woohoo! That's Hamas's feminism, okay? But even then, there's a catch. Only one kind of woman will be eligible to become a suicide bomber, she who has dishonored. The premise being that by taking her life and that of many others with her, many innocent others with her, she will be lifting the moral stain that she has left on a wider group of people. So under that kind of a code, a huge portion of the population will never be allowed to realize its individual talents. In other words, its talents as individuals. And when you can't realize your talents as an individual, you aren't allowed to think freely. You aren't allowed to be an individual and to have your own voice spoken in your own name without it reflecting on a much larger group of people. Under those circumstances, I have a very hard time understanding how democracy can emerge.